What if the most dangerous part of a warship isn't the ship at all, but a hole in a mountain that nobody can see? Right now, along a stretch of Iranian coastline, there are hundreds of feet of solid rock hiding something the most advanced military on the planet has spent months trying to find. Before we go any further, hit that like button like it's the detonator on a story you don't want to miss. Tap subscribe so the next update lands straight in your feed, and send this to one person who still thinks this war is simple. Now, let's get into it. Picture a cliff. Face on the southern edge of Iran. From above, it looks empty. No trucks, no heat signal, no movement worth a second glance. Just rock falling into the water. Then, in seconds, part of that cliff opens up, and small boats shoot out toward the shipping lanes at speeds that make radar operators scramble. By the time anyone reacts, the boats are already gone. This isn't a scene from a thriller. It's a real tactic, built over almost 20 years. And it has become one of the most important pieces of a war that has already changed the entire Middle East. To understand why this matters, you need to go back to how it all started. In late February 2026, a joint American and Israeli operation struck targets across Iran in a single devastating night. Iran's supreme leader was killed in that strike, along with several senior commanders. Iran's government declared weeks of national mourning and launched missiles and drones at Israel, at American bases in the region, and at Gulf states it blamed for allowing their land to be used against it. Within days, the region was an open war. What followed was a brutal campaign against Iran's Navy. American and Israeli aircraft hit ports, missile batteries, and naval bases along the southern coast. Within the first weeks, open-source analysts estimated that as much as 70% of Iran's visible surface fleet had been destroyed or crippled. On the other side of the country, near the Caspian Sea, separate strikes sank a minesweeper, several missile boats, and an aging warship in a single operation. Iran's big, expensive vessels, the ones that show up clearly on satellite images, were being wiped out fast. So here's the question that actually drives this whole story. If most of Iran's visible navy was gone within weeks, why are people still talking about hidden coastal bases as a serious threat months later? The answer is where this gets genuinely fascinating, and it's a part of the story a lot of coverage online has gotten wrong or oversimplified. For roughly 2 decades, a branch of Iran's military that runs separately from its regular navy has been carving fortified tunnels straight into the rock along its southern coast and on islands scattered through the Strait of Hormuz. These aren't sandbag bunkers or shipping containers buried under dirt. These are engineered cave systems, complete with docks built into the stone itself, so that small, fast attack boats can be sheltered, refueled, rearmed, and sent back out within minutes of an order. Analysts who track this network believe Iran has built at least 10 of these hidden bases. One island in particular keeps coming up in reports as the center of operations for Iran's naval special forces, a unit reportedly trained and equipped using methods borrowed from the very country it now finds itself fighting. Sit with that for a second. Iran studied the tactics of the country it expected to face one day and used that knowledge to build defenses meant to outlast it. Here's why this actually matters. If you think about it from a military planner's point of view, a warship, a frigate, a destroyer is enormous and impossible to hide. You can track it from orbit for days before it fires a single shot, and once real fighting starts, it becomes an easy target. That's basically what happened to most of Iran's conventional navy in this war's opening weeks. But a small attack boat, tucked inside a carved-out cave with hundreds of feet of solid rock sitting above it, like armor nature built for free, is nearly invisible. It doesn't give off the heat signature of an engine running outdoors. It doesn't cast a shadow anyone is watching for. It simply waits inside the mountain. Even after that punishing opening campaign against Iran's visible navy, detailed reporting shows the underground network kept sheltering most of what remained of the country's fast boat fleet. One widely cited estimate placed the number at more than 60% of the surviving fleet, still hidden inside these mountain bases well into spring. By that point, the total count of destroyed or damaged Iranian naval assets had climbed past 150, a staggering number on paper, but weighted heavily toward big, easy-to-spot targets rather than these small, scattered boats hidden inside rock. Separate reporting around the same time said the American military had only managed to sink roughly half of these hidden fast boats by mid-spring without giving exact numbers, simply because so many of them are too small and too well hidden to reliably confirm from satellite or drone footage while they sit inside their shelters. So what's actually happened in just the past couple of weeks? This is the part worth being careful about, because there's a real difference between what's confirmed and what's just floating around social media with more confidence than the facts support. Multiple waves of strikes have hit a coastal region in the south over the past 2 weeks, including attacks that reportedly struck military sites across several coastal towns overnight. Iran's own state media confirmed a string of explosions across that stretch of coastline in a single night. Independent outlets separately confirmed strikes hitting Iranian military facilities in that same area during the same window of fighting. Just recently, U.S. Central Command announced it had completed a roughly 90-minute operation aimed specifically at coastal defense systems, cruise missile storage sites, launch positions, and coastal surveillance facilities. The stated goal was to reduce Iran's ability to threaten commercial ships moving through the Strait of Hormuz. Now here's where I want to slow down, because some corners of the internet are treating this latest wave as the moment the tunnel network itself, the actual carved-out boat shelters, finally got cracked open for good. What can actually be confirmed from official statements and independent reporting is that recent strikes hit coastal defenses, missile storage, surveillance sites, and military installations near the towns where these hidden bases are known to sit. What cannot be confirmed, at least not yet, is a direct strike on the tunnel entrances or the deep cave systems themselves. No official release and no outlet covering this has described breaching or collapsing the underground boat shelters as a distinct, confirmed event. That distinction matters. Hitting the area around these hideouts is real, and it's happening on a near-weekly basis. Claiming the hardened tunnels themselves have been cracked open is, right now, not something anyone can honestly verify. Let's talk about why these caves have been so stubborn to destroy, because it's genuinely one of the hardest problems in modern warfare. Hardened facilities carved into solid rock sit near the top of the list of the toughest targets any Air Force can face. You're not dealing with a building that collapses the moment a bomb lands nearby. You're dealing with hundreds of feet of dense mountain acting as natural armor that no engineer had to design, because the mountain already did the work. Reporting on Iran's separate underground missile complexes, built with the same basic approach as the coastal caves, described one facility buried roughly 500 meters inside solid granite. A rock so dense it presents one of the toughest barriers even for the most powerful bunker-busting weapons in America's arsenal. That same reporting described an internal rail system running through the tunnels, connecting storage areas and multiple hidden exits, essentially describing a small underground city rather than a simple bunker with a door. The construction logic across Iran's hardened infrastructure is basically the same everywhere. Use naturally dense rock, build several separate entrances, design internal chambers so one collapse doesn't take out the whole structure, force any attacker into a target that can't be neutralized with a single clean strike, no matter how precise the weapon is. Destroying something like this usually needs specialized weapons built to bury deep before detonating, extremely accurate intelligence on the internal layout, and often several repeated strikes, just to achieve what military planners call a true mission kill, rather than surface damage that looks dramatic on video, but changes nothing underground. And even after a hit, a facility with multiple entrances can often keep functioning at reduced capacity, because sealing one doorway doesn't seal the whole mountain. Quick pause. If this kind of deep, sourced breakdown is more useful to you than another loud headline, show it some love. Smash that, hit subscribe, and drop this in a group. Chat where people actually argue about this stuff. It genuinely helps this channel keep making them. Okay, back to it. Now let's talk about why Iran built this entire system in the first place, because the reasoning behind it tells you a lot about how a smaller power thinks when it knows it can never outmatch a giant military head-to-head. Iran has known for decades it cannot build a navy that matches the United States ship or dollar for dollar. Instead of chasing an impossible goal, Iranian planners made a calculated bet on asymmetric warfare. Choose large numbers of small, cheap, fast, and genuinely disposable boats over a handful of expensive, prestigious ships that would simply get destroyed within days of a real war starting, which is more or less exactly what happened to Iran's conventional navy in this conflict's opening weeks. This approach has a name. It's called swarming. Dozens of small boats, some carrying anti-ship missiles, some carrying torpedoes, some carrying nothing but a crew and explosives, launch from scattered hidden points along the coast and converge on a single larger target at once, overwhelming its defenses through sheer numbers and unpredictability rather than raw firepower. There's well-known footage from years before this war even began, showing Iranian fast boats swarming close to an American warship in the Strait of Hormuz, approaching from multiple directions in a winding pattern while radio warnings went unanswered. That old footage was basically a preview of exactly the kind of scattered, hard-to-fully-stop threat these coastal caves exist to protect, even under heavy air attacks. Today, it's worth understanding that these coastal boat caves aren't the only piece of this puzzle. Iran has separately built what its own officials have publicly called missile cities, huge underground tunnel networks stretching for miles in some cases, built specifically to store and launch the country's missile arsenal. Footage reviewed by open-source defense researchers has shown these facilities packed with weapons, with independent analysts estimating some of these complexes may hold hundreds, possibly thousands, of missiles combined. Iranian officials have described some sites as functioning almost like a reloadable launcher, rather than a single-use position, meaning one hardened site can fire, reload from deep inside the mountain, and fire again, rather than being destroyed the moment it's used and spotted. The reason this matters here is that it shows the exact same thinking behind the coastal boat caves, just applied to a different weapon. Whether it's a mountain packed with missiles or a cliff carved out to shelter attack, boats. The underlying strategy is identical. Use Iran's naturally rocky terrain to build infrastructure that a conventional air campaign simply cannot wipe out in one pass, no matter how advanced that air campaign is. This forces any opponent into a long, grinding, expensive fight instead of the fast, clean victory political leaders always hope for and almost never actually get. There is one real weakness worth mentioning here, because it's important for balance, and it pushes back against the idea that these facilities are somehow completely unbeatable. Reporting on Iran's underground missile complexes has noted that in some of these tunnels, weapons are stored out in the open along long corridors and large caverns, with limited or no internal blast doors separating different storage sections. That detail matters a lot from a tactical standpoint. If an attacker manages a successful strike into one of these open chambers, the resulting explosion, combined with possible secondary blasts from nearby stored weapons, could cause damage that spreads through a much larger section of the facility than a single strike would normally achieve against a properly divided target. This detail specifically describes the missile storage complexes rather than the coastal boat caves, but it's a useful reminder that hardened doesn't automatically mean flawless, and that the internal design of any one facility matters enormously to how survivable it really is once it takes a direct, well-placed hit. Now let's step back and look at the human and economic cost of this part of the war, because it's easy to get lost purely in strategy talk and forget that real people live along this coastline. Iran's own health ministry has reported dozens of civilians killed and hundreds more injured in the most recent round of strikes alone, including women and children, according to figures international outlets have reported, while noting they could not independently verify the exact numbers. Separately, an attack near one of the locations, identified as home to Iran's naval special forces, reportedly killed a telecommunications worker and injured 2 colleagues, ordinary civilian employees, who had nothing to do with military operations happening near their workplace. This matters because these hidden bases aren't sitting in some empty military zone in the middle of nowhere. They sit along stretches of coastline where ordinary jobs, ordinary homes, and ordinary lives exist too, and that reality doesn't vanish just because a nearby target has military value to someone far away. Let's talk about what this war has cost Iran economically, because the naval blockade running alongside these strikes is a massive and often overlooked part of the story, and it might matter more to Iran's long-term position than any single strike does on its own. The United States imposed a formal naval blockade on Iranian ports in the spring, after an earlier round of ceasefire talks collapsed and briefly raised hopes the war might wind down quickly. Within weeks, defense officials were estimating the blockade alone had already cost Iran billions of dollars in lost oil revenue. Vault at more recent figures put the ongoing cost at roughly $500 million a day, a genuinely staggering drain on an economy that was already strained from years of prior sanctions. Central Command has reported intercepting dozens of vessels attempting to break through the blockade, with several ships seized outright. Yet independent shipping industry tracking suggests dozens of vessels have still managed to slip past it, which tells you something important. The blockade is punishing, but it isn't airtight, and Iran keeps finding cracks to use. You end up with 2 tracks of pressure running side by side, and this might be the most important structural point in the whole story. Direct strikes on Iran's remaining naval assets and hidden boat bases on one track, and a massive economic squeeze through the blockade on the other, both clearly aimed at the same goal, permanently ending Iran's ability to threaten shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Here's a wrinkle in this story that deserves more attention than it's currently getting, and it's a good example of why you should be careful about any single headline promising total final victory. The destruction of most of Iran's conventional navy in the war's opening weeks did not stop Iran from effectively shutting down large parts of the Strait of Hormuz afterward. Defense analysts have pointed out there was barely any real role for Iran's big ships in this kind of asymmetric fight to begin with. The surviving fast boats have kept operating throughout the war, regardless of how many warships were sunk in port during those first brutal weeks. That's a striking thing to sit with, because it means destroying the expensive, prestigious vessels barely touched Iran's actual ability to threaten the strait. That capability was never centered on those big ships. It was always centered on the hidden, cheap, scattered boat network we've been talking about this whole time. There's also Iran's mine-laying capability, directly tied to the same coastal infrastructure, and it rarely gets mentioned alongside it. Open-source naval analysts have estimated that as much as 80% of Iran's mine-laying capacity survived the first 2 weeks of intense air strikes back in early spring. That matters enormously for the Strait specifically, because any future attempt to physically clear mines from that waterway would likely draw exactly the kind of high-speed boat resistance these hidden coastal bases exist to shelter and support. Mine warfare is genuinely underrated as a threat. Unlike a missile, a mine doesn't need continuous guidance or a crew standing by, and it can sit quietly in a shipping lane for months, forcing an opponent into slow, careful mine-clearing operations that are themselves extremely vulnerable to exactly the fast boat ambush tactics we've walked through. Even if the fighting stopped tomorrow, the mines and the boats defending them would remain a real, lingering danger, and clearing that danger safely could take months of careful, risky work, long after any ceasefire is signed. This same underground philosophy connects to something else worth mentioning: the first combat use of American sea drones in this war, which reportedly struck a submarine and ship maintenance site along the coast earlier in the conflict. Iran's submarine fleet is smaller and far less advanced than a major naval power's, built around older diesel-electric boats bought decades ago, alongside domestically built coastal submarines designed for shallow waterwork and mine-laying in the Gulf's tight waters, plus a handful of larger submarines capable of operating hundreds of feet below the surface for weeks at a time, armed with torpedoes, mines, and cruise missiles. None of that rivals a modern American or European submarine force in raw capability, but that was never really the goal. Just like the fast boats and the missile cities, Iran's submarine force exists to complicate an opponent's picture inside a narrow, crowded waterway, adding one more unpredictable variable beneath the surface. There's a broader lesson buried in all of this that goes far beyond Iran, and it's worth pausing on. Every major military power on Earth has spent the last few decades investing in exactly the kind of technology meant to make hiding impossible. Satellites that scan coastlines every few hours, drones that can loiter overhead for a full day without landing, infrared sensors sensitive enough to catch the heat of a single running engine from miles away. On paper, that should mean nowhere is truly hidden anymore, but rock doesn't heat up like metal. Stone doesn't move like a convoy. A cave with no visible entrance doesn't trigger the same alerts a parked truck does. So even with all that technology stacked on top of each other, a mountain with a door built into it can still slip past all of it, simply by doing nothing at all. That's the quiet lesson smaller militaries around the world have clearly been paying attention to, and it's exactly why this coastal cave strategy isn't just an Iran story. It's a preview of how future conflicts against technologically superior militaries might actually be fought, not with bigger weapons, but with smarter ways of disappearing. Put all of this together, and what you're really looking at is a layered defense strategy Iran has built patiently, piece by piece, over roughly 20 years. Coastal boat caves built for swarming attacks on shipping, underground missile cities built for longer range, strikes on regional targets, a real mine-laying capability woven throughout all of it, and a modest but genuine submarine force adding one more layer of uncertainty underwater. No single piece of that system is enough on its own to beat the United States military in a straight, head-on fight, and honestly, no one serious, including Iran's own military leadership, has ever claimed otherwise. But as a combined layered package, it's specifically built to make any campaign against Iran slow, expensive, and messy, rather than fast and clean, the way political leaders always promise before the fighting actually starts. Before we go further, let's do this differently. Type the word Hormuz in the comments right now if you made it this far, just so I know how many of you actually stick around for the deep stuff instead of the highlight reel. Then tap like and subscribe, because the next update on this war is coming, whether the headlines are ready for it or not. Let's touch on the diplomatic side of this for a moment, because these strikes aren't happening in a vacuum, separate from the negotiations running quietly in the background. This entire war traces back to the earlier collapse of ceasefire talks, which directly triggered the blockade in the first place. Since then, the conflict has moved through multiple rounds of intense fighting and brief pauses, each one raising hope of a real resolution before falling apart within days. There have been reports of senior Iranian officials traveling to regional capitals for events some analysts think could double as informal back-channel contact, given how often certain Gulf states have played the role of mediator in the past. It's worth being careful here, because showing up at a ceremony is not the same as active negotiation, and there's rarely solid confirmation that meaningful talks are actually happening behind closed doors. But it's worth noting the diplomatic track hasn't gone completely dark either, and wars like this one often end through exactly this combination: military pressure on one side and quiet diplomacy running on the other. It's also worth thinking for a moment about what this kind of warfare, hitting scattered, hardened targets day after day, actually looks like from the perspective of the people carrying it out. Because it's a very different experience than the dramatic single-strike clips that go viral online. This isn't one clean operation that wraps up the whole story in an afternoon. It's dozens of separate missions spread across weeks, each one working off updated intelligence, each one accepting that you probably won't get everything in a single pass, and each one requiring careful verification before a single weapon is released. That grinding, repetitive reality doesn't make for a dramatic headline, but it's a far more honest description of how a campaign against this kind of infrastructure actually plays out. So let's think for a second about what happens if this cat and mouse pattern simply keeps going. If Iran's underground network keeps sheltering a meaningful share of its fast boats and missiles, no matter how many strikes hit the surrounding coastline, and if the United States and its partners aren't willing to accept the cost of a ground operation that might actually be needed to physically clear these tunnels, you could end up with a long-term standoff. Strikes and blockades, continuing indefinitely without either side reaching a clean final resolution. That's not a satisfying conclusion, but historically it's the most likely one. Campaigns against hardened, scattered, ideologically driven defensive networks rarely end with one dramatic collapse. They tend to end through some mix of exhaustion, quiet diplomacy, and slowly shifting calculations on both sides. So here's the clearest way to sum up what's actually known and what's still genuinely uncertain, because that's the responsible way to close a story with this many moving pieces. It's confirmed that Iran built and maintained an extensive network of at least 10 hardened cave and tunnel bases along its southern coast and on strategic islands, specifically to shelter its fast attack boats from exactly this kind of sustained air campaign. It's confirmed that the United States has repeatedly struck military facilities, coastal defenses, missile storage, and surveillance infrastructure across multiple coastal locations over the past month, including in just the past week. It's confirmed, based on the most recent reporting available, that a majority of Iran's surviving fast boat fleet, more than 60% by one widely cited estimate, was still believed to be sheltered inside these underground bases. What's uncertain is whether this most recent wave represents a genuine breakthrough against the hardened tunnels themselves, as opposed to continued pressure on the surrounding coastal area, since no confirmed breach of the deep boat shelters appears anywhere in the sourcing available right now. Treat any claim that says otherwise with real skepticism until it's actually confirmed. So here's the actual bottom line. What Iran built along its coastline is a smart, low-cost answer to a problem every smaller military eventually faces when it's up against a much larger, more advanced force. The fact that it's still functioning at a meaningful level, months into one of the most intense sustained air campaigns in recent memory, tells you something important about the real limits of even overwhelming air power when it's up against infrastructure built specifically to survive it. The United States has clearly done enormous historic damage to Iran's conventional navy, and it has been steadily grinding away at the coastal footprint surrounding these hidden bases, strike after strike. But the honest picture right now is one of sustained pressure, not a single knockout blow. It's a far more useful way to understand where this war is actually headed than any headline promising instant, total victory, because wars against scattered, well-hidden, asymmetric threats like this one tend to end through exactly this kind of slow, grinding pressure, not one dramatic moment that wraps everything up cleanly. It would be so easy to just repeat the loudest version of every headline crossing the feed today. It would probably even get more attention in the short run. But that's not actually useful to you, and it's a big part of why so much war coverage online eventually gets tuned out once reality catches up with the exaggerated claims. The goal here has always been simple. Give you what's actually confirmed, flag clearly what isn't, and trust that you'd rather have the accurate, slightly more complicated picture than a satisfying one that falls apart the moment someone checks the sourcing. Because here's the real story hiding underneath all of this. A cave carved into rock doesn't care about headlines, doesn't care about press conferences or dramatic footage or promises of quick victory. It just sits there, patient, waiting, doing exactly what it was built to do. And as long as that mountain keeps standing, so does the threat inside it. That's the part nobody wants to say out loud because it doesn't fit into a 30-second clip. This war won't end with one perfect strike lighting up a mountainside on camera. It will end slowly, quietly, through pressure that keeps building long after the cameras stop paying attention. And when it finally does end, it won't be because someone found the one strike that changed everything. It will be because, piece by piece, day by day, the mountain finally ran out of places left to hide. If you want to understand where this war goes next before it becomes tomorrow's headline, you already know what to do. Like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the real version of this story, not the loud one. I'll see you in the next one with whatever comes next, the moment it's actually confirmed.